Good evening, everyone. Tonight we step back into the heart of the industrial age to discover what life was truly like for the children who worked inside the great Victorian factories. The sound of the machines, the air filled with dust, and the courage it took simply to survive. If you enjoy these quiet historical stories, please like and subscribe. It helps me keep making them. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to know who's joining us from different corners of the world. Now, settle in, lower the lights, let the hum of your room become the hum of the factory, and let's begin. I am old now. My hands shake when I hold a cup of tea, and my lungs wheeze like bellows left out in the rain. I think this is a fitting end, a body that sounds like the machines I spent my childhood with. When I close my eyes, I do not see my grandchildren, or the rooms of the cottage where I have lived these last 20 years. I see the mill. I see it as clearly as I see my own hands before me, the great red brick building rising like a cathedral to something other than God, the windows that rattled when the engines turned, the long shadows cast by morning light across the spinning frames. You will ask me to tell you what it was like. People always do, eventually. They want to know if it was as hard as the stories say, if the noise was truly so loud that the girls lost their hearing by 20, if the air was thick enough to choke on. They want confirmation of something they have read in a newspaper or heard from a relation who knew someone. They want the truth served to them neat, like a glass of water from the well. I will tell you what I remember. I will tell you what the body remembers, for the body does not forget, even when the mind grows soft with age. My first memory is not of the mill. It is of my mother's hands. They were small, with fingers that had been burned red from washing clothes in scalding water. The nails were broken and yellowed. I must have been 3 or 4 years old. I cannot say for certain, for no one thought to mark such things in writing. We did not own a Bible with dates written in the front, as some families did. My mother rubbed these burned hands over my face one morning, and they smelled of lye soap and something else. Something like the metal smell of the water that came from the pump in the yard behind our lodgings. "Remember this," she said to me, though I do not know what she meant me to remember. The touch itself, perhaps, or the fact that she had hands, that she was there, that there was such a thing as tenderness, even in our small room in Manchester, where the light barely reached the window because of the smoke that hung over the city like a curse. My father worked at the mill before I did. He was a spinner, a skilled man, which meant he earned perhaps 12 shillings a week, an amount that seems now like a fortune, though it was never quite enough. There were 5 of us children then, myself, my elder sister Catherine, my brother Thomas, and twins born in the year before I was old enough to remember them clearly. My father would leave before dawn and return after dark, his clothes so black with dust that he seemed to be made of the mill itself. He would sit at our small table and eat bread and thin broth, and the dust would fall from his hair onto the food. My mother would pretend not to notice. "The wages are steady," he would say to her at night, when he thought we were sleeping. I would lie on the straw mattress that I shared with Catherine and listen to them speak in low voices. That is something. The mill is always turning, the work is there, and the pay comes regular. There was a kind of pride in this, though it was the pride of a man who had learned to value constancy above all else, who had learned that in a world that offered nothing but uncertainty, the promise of a wage on Friday was worth any price. We lived in a street of narrow houses, crammed so close that you could have thrown a stone from one window and hit another. The stone itself would have been difficult to find. The street was paved with something between stone and ash, a substance that changed colour with the rain and the soot. In winter, it froze into a surface that was treacherous and black. In summer, it became a paste that stuck to everything. The smell of that street was a smell I knew before I knew my own name. It was the smell of coal smoke, which came from the mill's chimneys, and also from the thousands of small fires in thousands of small houses, each one burning inferior coal because superior coal was expensive and belonged to people who were not us. It was the smell of human waste from the privies at the end of each row, which were emptied once a month in summer and once every 2 months in winter. It was the smell of unwashed bodies. There was a washroom where water could be heated for a few pence, but most people did not have a few pence to spare. It was the smell of boiling bones, for the butcher's scraps were bought by families to make broth. It was the smell of bread baking in the communal ovens. Families did not have their own ovens, so every household's loaves and pies were taken to the bakery on baking day, marked with the family's initials or, for those who could not write, their mark. These smells were not separate things to me. They were woven together into the very air I breathed, as inseparable as the threads in a piece of cloth. When I left that street, and I did leave it, though not for many years, I found that I missed it. This will seem strange to you. It seems strange to me even now. But a place that has held you, that has been the entire world to you, leaves its mark. The body knows no other air. The nose knows no other smell as home. I was 6 years old when my father told me that I would be going to the mill. I do not remember being asked. I do not remember a conversation in which my opinion was sought. One morning, instead of going to the streets to play with the other children, we played a game with a ball made of tied rags, or we would sit on the steps and watch the world pass. My father took my hand and led me toward the great building on the horizon, the one that seemed always to be belching smoke into the sky. "You are big enough now," he said. That was all. The walk took us nearly 3/4 of an hour. We passed through streets that grew progressively dirtier, more crowded, louder. The sound of the mill increased as we approached, a sound that I had always heard but not noticed, the way you do not notice the sound of your own breathing. Now, as we drew near, it became the only sound in the world. It was a low, rhythmic grinding, punctuated by sharper clacks, and the screech of things turning that should perhaps not have been turning. The gates of the mill were high and made of iron. They were painted green, though the paint was peeling, and underneath was rust the colour of dried blood. My father gave his name to a man at a small house beside the gate. The man checked something written on a piece of paper, nodded, and then pointed us toward a door. Inside, the noise became so loud that I could not think. This is not an exaggeration or a figure of speech. The human mind, I have learned, cannot function properly when surrounded by sustained noise of a certain volume. You do not hear individual sounds. You hear instead a roar, a wall of sound, and your thoughts become separate from this roar, floating somewhere above it or beneath it, never quite touching it. The air was immediately thick. Not thick as fog is thick, but thick as something solid, something that required effort to push through and to breathe. This was not the smoke from the chimneys which was outside. This was a different kind of thickness, a combination of dust from the cotton and the lint that filled the air like a kind of snow that never melted. It coated everything. It coated my mouth and nose immediately. I would taste it on my tongue, gritty and faintly sweet, for the rest of my life. My father delivered me to a man called the Overlooker. This man was thin and had the kind of face that seemed never to have known laughter, though he must have been young once. He wore a dark suit and carried a stick, which I later learned he was not reluctant to use. He looked at me, as one might look at a piece of machinery to assess whether it was the correct size for a particular task. "How old?" he asked my father. "6, my father said. The Overlooker made a note. "He'll do for piecing. Can he count?" "A little," my father said. "That's more than we need. Start him Monday. 12 hours a day, same as the others. 6p a week." 6p a week. That was half of what my father earned for 3 times the work. But what choice was there? There were 6 of us now, and the broth was thinner than it had been. There was less bread. My mother's face had become the colour of old paper. My father placed his hand on my head for a moment. It was a rough, warm hand, and I remember the weight of it. Then he turned and left, and I was alone with the Overlooker and the thunder of the machines. The girl assigned to teach me was called Sarah. She must have been about 12, though to my 6-year-old eyes she seemed ancient. Her hair was pulled back so tightly that it was painful just to look at, stretched from her scalp in a way that I think must have hurt. She had the thin face and narrow chest of someone who had not eaten quite enough for quite a long time. Her fingers were marked with the marks of the work, stains that had become permanent, tiny scars where she had been caught by the spinning threads. "You're a piecer now," she told me, speaking loudly enough to be heard over the sound of the machines. "That means you tie the threads when they break. See?" She showed me the frame. I would learn later that it was called a drawing frame, but at that moment it was simply a terrifying landscape of moving parts. Spindles turned at speeds I could not track. Threads ran through the frame, and whenever one broke, Sarah would take the two ends and tie them together with a knot so small and quick that I could barely see it happening. Then she would pull a lever to start the machine again. "It's easy," she said. "You just tie the knot. Don't let it get caught in the spindle, or you'll lose your finger. That happened to Tommy last month. Lost it clean off. So, just mind yourself." She was stating a fact as simply as one might say the sky is blue. Somewhere in this building, a boy named Tommy now had 4 fingers instead of 5. This was simply the price of inattention, the cost of working the machines. For the first several hours, I was not given anything to do. I was told to watch and to listen. I was told where the water was, a pail in the corner that became increasingly dirty as the day went on. I was told where the lavatory was, a small room at the end of the building that was so foul that I would learn to hold my bladder rather than use it. I was told that if I needed to sit down, I could do so only during the breakfast break and the dinner break, which came at noon. The morning was endless. The light came from high windows that were so covered in dust and soot that they might as well have been opaque. Most of the light in the mill came not from the windows but from the oil lamps that hung every 20 feet or so, casting shadows that made the machines seem like living creatures, things that were breathing and moving of their own volition. The noise never ceased. It was not that I became accustomed to it, as I am sometimes told that people do. I never became accustomed to it. What happened instead was that the noise became a kind of baseline, a constant against which other sounds were measured. The crack of the overseer's stick when he hit a child was loud against the background of the machines. The crying of a small child, there were many of them, some no older than 4, brought in for the easiest tasks, was audible as a piercing note above the grinding and clacking. At 8 o'clock in the morning, a bell rang. This bell was louder than the sound of the machines, and it cut through everything. The machines began to slow. The overlooker shouted something that I did not hear, but the workers began to move toward a corner of the mill where there was a small room. This was the breakfast break. Sarah pulled me along. "Come on," she said. "We've got 15 minutes." 15 minutes. At that time in my life, 15 minutes seemed like an eternity. It is strange how time works when you are a child. A single day at the mill felt like it contained weeks. An hour was a vast expanse that could not be crossed. The breakfast room was crowded and hot. People sat on the floor or on low benches, and they ate food that had been packed that morning. I had brought nothing. No one had told me to bring anything. Sarah offered me a piece of her bread. It was dark and dense, and it tasted slightly of salt. I ate it very slowly, trying to make it last the entire 15 minutes. "You'll get used to it," Sarah said. "The hunger, I mean. At first it's bad because you're not expecting it. But after a while, you just stop thinking about your stomach." I did not believe her then. The hunger I felt that morning was the most intense hunger I'd ever known. But she was right. Within a few weeks, the hunger became simply part of the landscape of my existence, like the noise or the dust. It was always there, but it was no longer remarkable. At the end of the 15 minutes, the bell rang again. The workers finished their food, those who had any left, and filed back into the main room. The machines started again, and the morning resumed as if it had never been interrupted. By the time the dinner bell rang at noon, I felt as though I had been at the mill for my entire life. My ears rang with the sound of the machines. My throat was dry from the dust in the air. My eyes burned from the strain of trying to see in the dim light. Every part of my body ached with a weariness that I did not have words for. We were given an hour for dinner. Sarah and I went outside into a yard behind the mill. The air here was marginally better, though it was still thick with smoke. There was a well, and we drew water and drank it. It was cold and tasted faintly of iron. "They feed some of the children," Sarah told me as we sat on the ground, our backs against the brick wall of the mill. "But not us. We have to bring our own food, or we go hungry. Last month, one of the littler ones got faint during the shift. Just fell right over. They took him to the back, and he came to after a bit, and then they sent him back to work. His parents came and shouted at the overseer, but there was nothing to be done. The boy had fainted, so they said he was weak and not suited to the work. But there's plenty of weak children. Weak children are cheaper, so that's what they hire." I did not understand all of this then, but I understood that weakness was something to hide, something that would be punished. I understood that the world of the mill had its own rules, and those rules were very different from the rules of the street where I had lived all my life. The first year at the mill was the hardest, though I did not know this at the time. I knew only that each day was hard, that the weariness was bone deep, that there were marks on my fingers from the broken threads cutting into my skin. Sarah's hands were covered in these marks, old and new. She showed them to me sometimes, tracing them like someone reading a map. "See this one?" she would say, holding her hand up to the dim light. That was from the drawing frame. I wasn't quick enough with the knot, and the thread pulled me forward. The spindle caught between my fingers and held me there for a moment before Sarah, not me, another Sarah, could pull the lever to stop the machine. I still have the scar, see? That was 2 years ago. By the time I'd been at the mill for 6 months, my hands looked like the hands of someone who had been working there for years. They were stained with the dust, which worked its way into every line and crevice. The nails were broken and dark underneath. The tops of my hands were marked with small cuts and older scars. I'd developed a kind of callus on my fingers where the threads would catch, so that I felt pain less acutely. This seemed like a mercy. My wages remained 6pence a week. This money was given directly to my father. I never saw it. I wore the same clothes that I had worn to the mill, simply because no one had provided me with anything else. They became progressively more worn and more stained. In winter, they became stiff with the damp, and I would arrive at the mill shaking with cold. The heat from the machines and the bodies packed closely together would warm me somewhat, but not entirely. My cough began in my second winter. It was a small cough at first, just something that tickled my throat now and then. But by March it had become something else, a deep, racking cough that would shake my entire body and leave me gasping. "Everyone coughs," the overlooker told me when he found me doubled over in the corner, unable to stop. "It's the dust. Breathe through your mouth, not your nose. It's easier." This advice was, I realise now, utterly backward. But I took it, and it did nothing to help. The cough persisted. It was the sound of my body trying to expel the cotton dust that I had been breathing in for months. The dust did not leave. It settled into my lungs, where it would remain for the rest of my life. By my second year at the mill, I had been promoted. This is not quite the right word. It is not as though I was given a choice or congratulated. What happened was that I grew tall enough to work the spinning frame directly, rather than merely tying threads. This meant longer hours and more responsibility. It also meant slightly higher wages, 3pence more per week, bringing my total to 9pence. But it also meant a different kind of danger. The spinning frame was a machine about 8 feet long, with spindles running along its length. My job was to mind the spindles, to ensure that the thread wound properly, to watch for breaks and tangles. The spindles rotated at great speed, and a moment of inattention could result in an injury that would end in blood and pain or, in the worst cases, in the end of the shift that never began again. I lived in constant fear of the spindles. This is not something I am exaggerating. For 12 hours a day, 5.5 days a week, I was aware of the spindles, as I was aware of my own heartbeat, a constant underlying awareness of danger. The other children working the frames with me had various injuries. One boy named Henry had lost part of his arm. He could still work. They found ways to make him useful, but he moved slowly and with obvious pain. A girl named Margaret had deep scars running up the left side of her face, where she had been thrown against a sharp edge when her hair was caught in a spindle. The precautions against injury were minimal. We were told to keep our hair tied back, which I did with a bit of twine. We were told to keep our clothing tight and to tuck anything loose into our pockets or our belts. We were told to stay alert, but the machines did not care about our precautions. They were hungry, indifferent things, and they turned regardless of our vigilance. I remember the day that William's hand was caught. He was a boy about my age, and we had been working near each other for several months. I did not know him well. The noise made conversation nearly impossible, and our breaks were too short for real friendship. But we knew each other in the way that people know each other when they share a room and the same exhaustion. His machine had malfunctioned in some way. The thread had knotted, and when he reached in to clear it, his hand somehow became involved in the mechanism. There was a moment where nothing seemed to happen. Then there was blood, what stained the floor and would not wash away, and a sound that cut through the noise of the machines, a sound of pain and terror that I have never forgotten. The machines were stopped. This was always the signal that something bad had happened. The overlooker came running. There were shouts. William was taken away, and later we heard that what remained of his hand had been wrapped in cloth and that he had been sent home to his parents. We did not see him again. "He'll be no more use," said Sarah, who was still at the mill, still tying threads, though by then she was 17 and had been there for nearly a decade. "Once they can't work, they send them back. The mill doesn't keep the ones who can't work." This was the logic of the place, and it was inexorable. You had a value as long as you could work. The moment your value diminished, you ceased to matter. There was always another child to take your place. Always. I have tried, in my old age, to remember the exact feeling of exhaustion at the end of a 12-hour shift. This is difficult because the exhaustion has faded now, replaced by the exhaustion of age, which is quite different. The exhaustion of a child at the mill was total. It was not merely physical, though it was certainly that. It was mental, in the sense that the mind became too tired to function. It was emotional. There was a kind of despair that came at the end of the day, a sense that you had survived another day, but that tomorrow would be exactly the same, and the day after that, and the day after that, for the rest of your life. I would walk home in the dark because by the time we were released, the sun was already below the horizon. The walk took me through the narrowest, most crowded streets of Manchester. These streets were not much different from the street where I lived, but they felt foreign at that hour, when I was so tired that I could barely place one foot in front of the other. My mother would have a small meal waiting, usually a kind of thin stew with very little meat and some vegetables if they were in season and cheap enough. I would eat this sitting at the table. I would then lie down on my mattress and I would be asleep before my head touched the cloth stuffing. I would sleep the sleep of total exhaustion, a sleep so deep that I did not dream. Or if I did dream, I did not remember it. In the morning, the sound of my father rising and preparing for his own day at the mill would sometimes wake me, or sometimes I would wake from a kind of internal alarm that my body had learned to recognize, the knowledge that morning had come, and that I had to be at the mill gates by 5:30, or I would be locked out and lose a day's wages. My relationship with my father changed during these years. When I was very small, he had been a figure of warmth and authority, though I did not see him often or for long periods. As I grew older and began working at the mill, something shifted. We were now both creatures of the mill, both shaped by it, both exhausted by it. But he had the authority of an adult and a man, while I was a child and growing smaller in the hierarchy of the place. We rarely spoke beyond the perfunctory exchanges necessary for living in the same room. He would sometimes speak to me about the work, offering small pieces of advice. "Watch the tension on the threads," he told me once. "If it goes too tight, it will snap. If it goes too slack, the spindle will slip. You have to develop a feel for it, the way you might develop a feel for a horse's reins." I did not know what horses' reins felt like, but I understood the principle. The work required a kind of constant, minute attention, a calibration of pressure and timing that had to become instinctive. To think too much about it was to fail. You had to let your hands do the thinking, while your mind drifted somewhere else. By the time I was 12, I'd been at the mill for 6 years. 6 years. This was now my entire world. I could barely remember the time before the mill. I could remember my mother's burned hands, but I could not remember her face quite clearly. I could remember my brother Thomas, but not the sound of his voice. The mill had consumed these memories, worn them smooth like stones in a river, until they no longer had sharp edges. Around this time, there began to be talk of change. There were people, good people, we were told by the vicar at the church where we sometimes went on Sunday, when we were not too exhausted, which was rarely, who believed that children should not work such long hours, that we should have time for schooling, that there were laws being passed in Parliament to protect us. I did not understand how there could be laws about our work. The mill belonged to the owner, and we worked there because we were paid to do so. It seemed to me as natural as rain or winter. But the overseer began to be more careful about not allowing the smallest children to work more than a certain number of hours per day. The girls my age were sometimes sent home a bit earlier than the rest of us. This change happened in small increments over several years, and I do not remember it ever being formally announced. Every Sunday, if my family could afford to attend, and mostly we could not, because it felt like an enormous luxury sitting in a church instead of resting before the next week of work, we would go to the church near our street. It was a small church dedicated to St. Michael, though it was not nearly as grand as the name might suggest. It was a plain brick building with a small steeple, and inside it smelled of damp and candle wax and the unwashed bodies of poor people. The vicar would speak to us about obedience, about the will of God, about how the world was arranged according to a divine plan that we could not hope to understand. He spoke often about the parable of the talents, how God expected us to use what he had given us, and how idleness was a sin. He spoke about the virtue of honest labour, about how work ennobled the soul and brought us closer to God. He spoke about contentment with one's station, about how envying those above you was a sin, and how the poor would be rewarded in heaven if they were good and obedient in this life. I remember one sermon in particular, delivered by a visiting vicar when I was about 14. He spoke about the factory workers, about us, saying that we should be grateful for the opportunity to earn wages, that other countries had far worse systems, that we were lucky to live in England under a system that provided work for everyone who was willing to work. He spoke about the owners of the mills as men doing God's work, providing employment and means of survival to those who would otherwise starve. This message was repeated constantly, in different variations. The world was as it should be. Our place in it was fixed and right. To work was to fulfill our purpose. To complain was to sin. The owners were not our oppressors, but our benefactors. I accepted this at the time. It seemed to me that this was simply how the world was. I had no frame of reference for anything else. But looking back, I can see how the messages of the church and the messages of the mill were aligned, how they worked together to make the conditions seem not merely acceptable, but righteous. My mother was more pious than my father. She would go to church when she could, and she would speak to us about God's plan, about bearing our trials with patience and grace. She would quote scripture at moments of particular hardship. When my baby sister took ill with what we later understood to be a wasting sickness, my mother spent days and nights beside her cot, praying, while the rest of us continued our work. The child recovered slightly, but she never regained her full strength. She survived, but she was always thin, always pale, always coughing. My mother attributed her survival to prayer. God preserved her, she said. He saw that we were faithful, and he spared her. I did not challenge this, but I thought about William's hand, about Margaret's scarred face, about the children who had not survived their illnesses or their accidents. Surely they had faithful mothers too. Surely God could have preserved them. The logic did not quite work, but I did not have the words to articulate this, and I do not think it would have been acceptable to voice such doubts. There was also a charity school attached to the church, where children could receive some basic instruction in reading and writing and arithmetic. Attendance was not mandatory, and most children of working families like mine never went. But during my 13th year, my mother somehow arranged for me to attend on one afternoon per week during the winter months. I think now that this must have cost money that we could not spare, or it cost her something else, something that I did not understand at the time. The school was held in a cold room attached to the church. There were about 15 children there, ranging in age from perhaps 7 to 15. The schoolmistress was a woman named Miss Hartwell, who was severe and thin and had a manner of speaking that made it clear that she believed herself to be doing us an enormous favour by attempting to teach us. "You are fortunate," she told us on the first day. "Many children in your circumstances receive no education whatsoever. You must appreciate this opportunity and apply yourselves with dedication." The instruction was quite basic. We learned to write our letters and to form simple words. We learned to read from a book of moral tales, each one designed to teach us lessons about obedience and virtue. We learned arithmetic sufficient for understanding wages and basic transactions. We learned the catechism. I was hungry throughout these lessons. The hunger was almost worse than the hunger at the mill, because here I was sitting still, and sitting still made you aware of your stomach in a way that moving about did not. But I also found that I was interested in the learning. There was something in the act of forming letters, of understanding how words worked, that seemed to open up a small space in my mind that the mill did not quite fill. I learned to read. though my reading was always somewhat laboured. I would mouth the words, sounding them out in a way that other children seem not to need to do. But once I understood the shape of a word, I could usually recognise it again. This opened up a world that I did not know existed. There were a few books in our street. One woman had a Bible that she had been given as a child. There was a man who kept old newspapers, which he sometimes allowed children to look at for a few pence. I would sometimes stand outside the window of a bookshop in the city centre, looking at the volumes displayed there, knowing that they contained worlds that I would never be able to enter, stories and knowledge and ideas that were closed to me. But even this small education was temporary. At the end of that winter, my mother could no longer afford to pay for the lessons, or perhaps she needed me more urgently to contribute my wages to the household. I stopped attending the school, and I never returned. By my 17th year, I had spent more than half my life at the mill. I was now one of the older workers, one of the people who remembered the time before certain rules had been implemented, before the Factory Act that limited hours for children and young persons. I'd grown tall and thin, stretched out in a way that the mill seemed to encourage. My shoulders were rounded from years of bending over the machines. My eyes were weak from the dim light and the constant strain of watching the threads. My hands were marked with scars and stains that would never fully wash away. I had also learned by this time a kind of philosophy about the work, though I would not have used that word to describe it. I had learned to divide my attention, to keep enough of my mind on the work to stay safe and productive, while allowing the rest of my mind to wander. I would think about things while my hands performed their tasks. I would imagine conversations with people I had never met. I would construct elaborate stories in my mind, set in places I had never been, featuring people who lived lives completely different from my own. This was a form of escape, and it was precious. It was the only escape available to me. The other form of escape was conversation, though this was difficult in the noise of the mill. We developed a kind of sign language and lip reading, a way of communicating without sound. We would pass notes when the overlooker was not watching. We would take breaks together and speak, shouting to be heard above the ringing in our ears. There was a girl named Eleanor who worked on the frames near mine. She must have been about my age, though I never asked her directly. She had red hair, which she kept tightly tied back, and a sharp, intelligent face. Unlike many of the other workers who had become dulled by the work, Eleanor seemed to be constantly alert, constantly thinking. She asked questions about things. "Why does the overlooker get to decide how much we're paid?" she asked me once during the dinner break. "Why don't we just refuse to work until they pay us more?" "Where would we go?" I asked. "What else would we do?" "There are other jobs," she said. "I know there are. My sister worked in service in a great house for a while. The pay was not much better, but the work was different. There are factories in other towns. There are jobs that are not in mills. But those jobs are probably just as hard," I said. "And we know how to work here. We know the machines. Isn't it better to stay where the work is known to you?" She looked at me with something like pity. "You sound like them," she said. "You sound like the owners. You sound like the vicar. They've made you believe that this is the only thing you can do, that you should be grateful for it." "Aren't we supposed to be grateful?" I asked, genuinely curious. "That's what they tell us." "Tell me something," she said, leaning close so I could hear her over the ambient roar. "If they're grateful to have us, why don't they pay us more? Why do they work us 12 hours a day? Why do they not provide safety for our hands? If we're such a blessing to them, why can't they afford to be kind?" These questions troubled me. They still trouble me even now when I am old and no longer at the mill. At the time, I did not have answers to them. I had been taught that the way things were was the way they should be, that this was the natural order. But Eleanor's questions suggested that there might be other ways of thinking, other ways of organising the world. We never became close friends. There was no time for close friendship at the mill. But I remembered her words, and I thought about them often. I wondered what had become of her. Some years after this conversation, she stopped coming to the mill. I never learned what happened to her. She simply did not come one day, and then she did not come the next day, and eventually I stopped noticing that she was not there. I'm not certain exactly when I stopped being a child. This transition did not happen on a particular day, when I woke up and found that something had changed. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way that light changes as the sun sets. At some point, though, I realised that I was no longer surprised by the hard things, that the exhaustion had become my baseline rather than something exceptional, that I no longer hoped that things might be different because I had learned that they would not be. By this time, my family had changed. My father still worked at the mill, but his health had begun to fail. The cough that had started in my second year had never left me, and it had also taken hold of him. He coughed constantly now, great racking coughs that would bend him double. At night, I could hear him from where I lay on my mattress, gasping for breath between the coughs. My mother would sometimes go to him, placing a hand on his back, though there was nothing she could do to help. The cough was sometimes called the mill sickness or the dust lung. Everyone who worked in the mills for long enough developed it to some degree. Some people seemed to manage it, to live with it as a chronic irritation. Others, like my father, seemed to be taken more seriously by it. He lost weight, his face became hollowed out. He began to miss days of work because he was too weak to rise in the morning. On the days when he did not work, he received no pay. Our household income, which had always been precarious, became genuinely unstable. My wages, and the smaller wages of my younger siblings who had by now also entered the mills, became the primary support for the family. I was barely out of my childhood, yet I was already the weight-bearing member of the household in a very real sense. My brother Thomas had started at the mill at age 5. He was 10 now, small for his age, and prone to minor illnesses. He worked as a piecer, as I had done, tying threads and minding the frames. He did not complain about the work, but he also did not seem to take the kind of quiet pride in it that my father did. He simply endured it, the way one endures cold weather or hunger. My sister Catherine, who had been so much a part of my early childhood that I could barely remember her clearly anymore, had left home at 16 to enter service as a maid in a wealthy household some miles from Manchester. I saw her only rarely, when she was given a Sunday off and could make the journey back. On these visits, she seemed like a stranger, someone from another world. She wore a uniform and had learned to speak differently, with a kind of careful propriety that made me uncomfortable. She also seemed, paradoxically, happier than she had been at the mill, though whether this was genuine happiness or merely the appearance of it, I could not say. Time moved strangely during this period of my life. Years would pass, and yet each day seemed identical to the day before. Monday through Saturday were an endless repetition. Sunday was a brief respite, though even Sunday was not entirely free. There were still meals to prepare, clothes to wash, endless small tasks that needed doing. The cycle would begin again on Monday morning, when the bell rang at 5 o'clock, and I rose in the darkness to begin the walk to the mill. I have tried, in my old age, to account for the years. I know that I was at the mill from the age of 6 until I was 22. That is 16 years, though it feels both longer and shorter than that number suggests. It feels longer because each year was filled with so many days, and each day was so filled with hours. It feels shorter because I remember so little of it distinctly. The days blur together into a kind of aggregate experience, rather than a series of separate events. What I remember are moments, sensations, small incidents that somehow fix themselves in my memory, while countless other incidents were worn smooth and forgotten. I remember the smell of the oil that was used on the machines, a smell that I would later learn was whale oil, precious and expensive. I remember the taste of the water from the well in the yard, which had a faintly mineral quality and tasted different depending on the season. I remember the feeling of my fingers moving through the motions of the work so many times that they could perform the task without any direction from my conscious mind. I remember the particular quality of the light on winter mornings, when we would be arriving at the mill just as the sky was beginning to lighten, the city still half asleep around us. I remember the sound of the bell that marked the beginning and the end of each segment of the day. I remember the sight of the threads breaking and the feeling of satisfaction when I had tied them back together perfectly, the knot small and tight and permanent. I remember the weight of my body at the end of a 12-hour shift, a weight so complete that it seemed as though gravity had doubled and I was walking against tremendous resistance. I remember the faces of the other workers, though I cannot now say with certainty which faces belonged to which bodies, or which names went with which faces. There was always a kind of transience to the people in the mill. Children would come and stay for a few years and then move on to other work or other towns. Young women would work for several years and then marry and leave. The only constants were the machines and the overlooker, who seemed as permanent as the building itself. The overlooker during my later years was a man named Mr. Bridges. He was in his 50s, with a heavy face and a perpetually angry expression. He had worked his way up from being a worker himself, and there was something in his bearing that suggested he believed his rise to be evidence of the rightness of the system. He had no sympathy for the workers. He was efficient and ruthless in his management of the mill. He believed that any moment not spent in productive labour was theft from the owner, and he moved about the mill constantly, watching for any slackening of pace, any moment of rest that could be forestalled. He carried a stick, as all the overlookers did, and he was not reluctant to use it. He would strike a child on the back or across the shoulders if they were caught daydreaming, if their pace slackened, if their attention drifted for even a moment. The pain was sharp and sudden, but worse was the humiliation. Children would cry, not always from pain, but from shame, from the feeling of being struck in front of their peers, of being marked as lazy or careless. I was struck several times by Mr. Bridges during my years at the mill. Once, when I was perhaps 18, I was caught staring out the window during the workday. There was a bird outside, a pigeon, and for just a moment I had been watching it instead of the threads. Mr. Bridges came up behind me and struck me across the back with his stick. The blow was hard enough to drive the air from my lungs and to leave a bruise that was visible for a week. But he did not say anything. He simply struck and walked away. This was preferable to the times when he would speak. His words were often worse than the physical punishment. He would speak to us about our worthlessness, about how we were fortunate to have work at all, about how he had known girls and boys like us to be turned out onto the street with nothing, and how we should be grateful that he did not do the same to us when we were lazy or careless. My father's health continued to deteriorate. By the time I was 20, he was no longer working regularly. He had taken to sitting at home during the day, coughing into a cloth. My mother had begun to look older, as though she were absorbing his illness, taking it into herself. She would hold his hand sometimes, speaking to him in low tones, though his mind was not always present in these conversations. One winter morning, when I was 21, my father did not rise. My mother had to tell me that he would not be going to the mill. I did not entirely understand what this meant at first. The previous evening he had been sitting at the table, coughing as usual. Now, suddenly, he was not going to the mill. This seemed impossible. The mill was the centre of everything. The mill was where you went every morning and every evening you returned from. If my father was not going to the mill, then something fundamental about the world had shifted. I did not go to the mill either that day. I sat with him instead. His breathing was laboured, and each breath seemed to require an enormous effort. He did not speak much. He looked at me several times as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. My mother brought him water, and he drank it slowly. As the day wore on, it became clear that he was very ill. My mother sent for the doctor, paying money that we could not afford. The doctor came in the afternoon, a man in a dark suit who examined my father by pressing his hand to his chest and listening. He said that my father had pneumonia, that his lungs were filled with fluid, that there was very little that could be done. He left some medicine, which cost more money, and said that we should keep him warm and quiet. My father did not recover. Over the course of the next week, his condition worsened. His cough became so severe that he could not speak. His skin took on a grey colour. He seemed to be fading, becoming less substantial, as though the illness was consuming him from the inside. I sat with him during this time. I held his hand. I did not know what else to do. I had never been close to death before. I had known it distantly. There had been deaths in our street, children who did not survive illnesses, the elderly who simply failed to rise one morning. But I had never sat vigil with death, never watched as a person I knew was taken by it. On the 7th day, in the early morning, my father's breathing changed. It became slower, more irregular, and then, quite suddenly, it stopped. I was holding his hand when it happened. One moment his chest was rising and falling, however faintly. The next moment, it was still. His hand, which had been warm, began to grow cool. The body that remained looked like my father, and yet it was not. Something essential had gone, and what remained was merely the shell. My mother wept. She wept for hours, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere very deep within her. I did not weep. I felt numb, unable to access the emotions that I knew I should be feeling. My father was gone. This was a simple fact, and yet it contained within it an enormity that I could not quite grasp. We had to prepare him for burial. This required money that we did not have. The vicar came and spoke to my mother about the cost of a funeral and burial. There were arrangements to be made. There was a grave to be paid for, a service, the digging of the earth. My mother looked at me when the vicar was speaking, and I understood that she was asking me, silently, whether we could afford this. I did not know. I did not know how much money we had, or what we owed, or what would happen if we could not pay for a proper burial. The neighbours helped. They contributed small amounts. The vicar reduced his fee. The grave digger took a smaller payment than usual. We held a service at the church. My father was buried in a grave at the edge of the churchyard, in a place reserved for people like us, people who could not afford a better burial. I watched as the earth was thrown over the wooden box that contained his body, and I tried to feel something more than the numbness that had settled over me. After my father's death, things changed in ways both subtle and profound. The burden of supporting the household fell entirely to me. My wages, combined with the smaller wages of my brother, and the money that my sister sometimes sent from her position in service, were now what kept us from complete destitution. I worked harder after his death, if such a thing were possible. I became more vigilant about not wasting a moment, about not giving the overlooker any reason to reduce my hours or my wages. I became, in a sense, what the system wanted me to be, a perfectly efficient worker, someone who could be relied upon to do exactly what was required without complaint. But something in me also hardened. The numbness that had set in after my father's death did not entirely lift. I continued to move through my life, to perform my tasks, to fulfill my responsibilities, but I did so with a kind of detachment, as though I were watching myself from a distance rather than truly inhabiting my own body. I was 23 years old, and I felt as though I had already lived an entire life. My body was worn. My lungs were damaged from years of breathing dust. My eyes were weak. My hands bore the marks of countless small injuries. And yet, I was still young enough to work, still useful to the mill. I could not imagine any other life, any other possibility. It was during this period that I first considered leaving the mill. This thought came to me not as a rebellion or a grand decision, but as a quiet, persistent question that would not go away. What if I simply did not come to work one morning? What if I walked in a different direction? What if I sought out other work, different work, work that did not involve the machines and the noise and the dust? But these thoughts always ended in the same way. Where would I go? What else could I do? I had no trade other than mill work. I had no family connections that might help me secure other employment. I had very little money saved, and most fundamentally, I had been trained by 16 years of mill work to believe that this was my place, that this was what I was suited for, that to expect anything else was to be ungrateful and unrealistic. So I continued to go to the mill. I continued to work the 12-hour shifts. I continued to breathe the dust and feel the weariness settle into my bones each night. And I told myself that this was my life, that there was no point in wishing for anything different, that I should be grateful to have work at all. In my 24th year, the mill changed hands. The owner, Mr. Pemberton, had died, and his son, a younger man who had been educated away from Manchester, took over the business. This new owner, Mr. Thomas Pemberton, seemed to have different ideas about how the mill should be run. He hired a new manager, a man named Mr. Ashworth, who was younger than Mr. Bridges, and who had some idea of what would later be called scientific management. He implemented new practices. The working day was reduced slightly, from 12 hours to 10 hours and 45 minutes. There was an attempt to improve the ventilation in the mill, though this attempt was only partially successful. There were new safety measures implemented, including guards on some of the machines and training for workers about how to avoid injury. These changes were relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, but they signalled something different, a recognition that the workers were not simply machines that could be pushed beyond their capacity indefinitely. It was possible, it seemed, to run a profitable mill while also treating the workers with something approaching basic humanity. I do not know what motivated these changes. Perhaps Mr. Ashworth genuinely believed that worker safety and welfare were important. Perhaps he calculated that better treated workers were more productive workers. Perhaps the new Mr. Pemberton felt some responsibility for the welfare of the people who worked for him, or perhaps he simply wanted to distinguish himself from his father by being a different kind of owner. Whatever the motivation, the effect on my life was real. I was still exhausted at the end of each working day, still breathing dust, still marked by the physical toll of the work. But the exhaustion was slightly less total. The dust was slightly less thick. The sense of danger, though never entirely absent, was somewhat reduced. More significantly, these changes meant that I could sometimes think about things other than survival. I could consider possibilities. I could wonder about other lives, other work. The tight band around my chest that had been there for so many years began, very slightly, to loosen. It was around this time that I met Margaret. She was not working at the mill. She was a maid at the boarding house where I took a room after my mother remarried. Her father had died when she was young, and she had been forced to go into service. She was intelligent and kind, and she reminded me that there were people in the world who did not smell constantly of dust and oil, who could speak normally without raising their voices to be heard over machinery, who had different possibilities for their lives. We would sometimes speak in the evenings after the day's work was done. She would ask me about the mill, and I would try to explain what it was like, though my descriptions always seemed inadequate. How could I make someone who had not lived it understand the way the noise became a kind of baseline, the way the dust worked its way into everything, the way 12 hours could feel like both an instant and an eternity? But I could also listen to her. She would tell me about the family she worked for, about the strange dynamics of a household where the servants were expected to be invisible, about the occasional kindness of the mistress of the house, about the tedious work of cleaning and washing and serving. "Is it better or worse than the mill?" I asked her once. She considered this carefully. "It's different," she said. "The work is less dangerous and my lungs are not damaged by it. But there is a kind of confinement in service that is different from the mill. At the mill there are many workers, and there is a kind of community. Is there not?" "There is," I admitted, "though it is not a comfortable community. We are all suffering the same things, but we do not speak about it." "In service," she said, "there is less community. The servants are separated from the family, from each other sometimes. There is hierarchy and secrecy, but there is also less noise, less physical danger, and more opportunity to use one's mind for things other than keeping up with the machines." These conversations opened something in me. They made me aware that I had choices, even if those choices were limited. They made me understand that the life I had been living was not inevitable, not the only possible life. When I was 26 years old, I made a decision. I gave notice at the mill. I told the new manager, Mr. Ashworth, that I would be leaving. He asked me where I was going, what other work I had secured. I told him that I did not yet know, but that I needed to leave. He was surprised, I think. Workers did not simply leave the mill. They stayed until they were no longer useful, or they died, or they were dismissed. But I had been a reliable worker for so many years that perhaps he felt some obligation to help me. "There are mills in Lancashire," he told me, "larger mills than ours with better wages. If you want to continue in mill work, I can give you a letter of recommendation. You have been a good worker here." I thanked him, but I told him that I thought I would like to try something else. He looked at me as though I had announced that I intended to walk to the moon. The last day that I worked at the mill, I arrived as I always did, in the darkness before dawn. I walked through the gates as I had done thousands of times before. I walked to my place at the machines, and I worked the machines one final time, my hands performing the familiar motions, my ears ringing with the familiar noise, my lungs breathing in the familiar dust. At the end of the shift, when the bell rang and the machines began to slow, I did not take off my work apron and put on my jacket. Instead, I simply walked out of the building. I walked through the gates and did not look back. I did not go to collect my wages, though I was owed money for the final week of work. I simply walked away. I do not remember the walk home clearly. I remember feeling as though I was walking through water, as though the air itself had weight and resistance. I remember the ringing in my ears gradually fading as I moved away from the mill. I remember the smell of the streets changing as I left the area surrounding the factory, becoming slightly less acrid and terrible. When I reached the room I rented, I sat on the bed and simply sat there for hours. I had left the mill. This fact seemed impossible, and yet completely real. What had I done? How would I support myself? How would I find other work? I did not know the answers to any of these questions. The first weeks after leaving the mill were difficult in ways that I had not anticipated. I had expected the physical difficulty, the loss of wages, the uncertainty about my future, the need to find other work. But I had not expected the psychological difficulty. For 16 years my life had been structured around the mill. Every day was the same. Every morning I knew what I would do and where I would go. Every evening I knew how exhausted I would feel. The mill had been a kind of external structure that held my life together. Without it, I felt unmoored, as though I was floating without anchor. I also discovered that the damage done to my body was more extensive than I had realized. When I was no longer working the machines, when my mind was not occupied by the constant vigilance required to keep my hands away from the spindles, I became aware of a constant, low-level pain in my lungs. When I tried to do physical work, any physical work, whether it was moving boxes or cleaning or manual labor, I would find myself gasping, my lungs refusing to expand fully, my breathing becoming labored and difficult. The cough that had started when I was 7 years old had never left. Now, without the distraction of the mill, it seemed to intensify. I would cough for hours at a time, particularly in the morning and at night. What I coughed up was sometimes flecked with what stained and would not wash away, a sign, I understood, that the dust was still in my lungs, still working its damage, even though I was no longer breathing it in. I found work as a porter, carrying goods at the railway station. It was physically demanding, but it was also outdoors sometimes, and the noise was different. Human noise and the sound of trains, rather than the sound of machines. The pay was less than I had been earning at the mill, but it was enough to live on combined with my savings. It was during this time that I began to understand what I had lost and what I had gained by leaving the mill. I had lost the structure, the certainty, the place in the world that the mill had provided, but I had gained something as well. Time, in a sense. Time to think, to wonder, to imagine possibilities. Time for conversations that were about more than the immediate necessities of survival. I spent my evenings reading. I'd learned to read as a child in that charity school, though my reading had been limited to the thin moral tales provided by Miss Hartwell and the fragments of newspapers I could access. Now I began to seek out books, borrowing them from a lending library run by a church near where I lived. I read novels and histories. I read newspapers and political tracts. I read accounts of the factory system written by people who had studied it and thought deeply about it. This reading was a revelation to me. I learned that there were people, reformers, some of them, who believed that the conditions in the mills were wrong, that children should not work 12-hour days, that workers deserved safety and reasonable hours and adequate wages. I learned that there had been attempts to change these conditions through legislation, that there were laws that had been passed limiting the hours that children could work. I also learned that there were people who believed that the entire system was wrong, that factories themselves were a kind of sin, that the industrial system was destroying human beings and the fabric of society. Some of these people advocated for going back to a simpler time when most people worked the land. Others advocated for a complete transformation of society into something new, something based on different principles. These ideas troubled me. They made me angry in ways that I had not been angry before. I realized that much of what I had endured could have been prevented. The exhaustion and the dust and the danger, these things were not inevitable. They were choices that had been made by people with power, choices that benefited the owners of the mills at the expense of the workers. I am an old man now, and I have lived many more years away from the mill than I lived in it. I worked as a porter until my lungs gave out entirely, and then I worked in different capacities, sometimes managing to work, sometimes not. I married Margaret. We had children. We lived a quiet life, and though we were never wealthy, we had enough. But the mill has never truly left me. It is written in my body in ways that I cannot escape. The cough that began when I was 7 is still with me, a constant companion in my chest. My hands, though no longer engaged in the repetitive motions of millwork, still bear the marks, the scars, the staining that will not wash away, the particular shape of my fingers that comes from years of tying threads. My lungs are damaged in ways that have become progressively more serious as I have aged. I cannot climb stairs without becoming severely short of breath. I cannot walk any distance without needing to rest. Doctors have told me that the cotton dust that I breathed in for 16 years has scarred my lungs, that the damage is permanent and progressive, that there is no cure for it. I do not know how much time I have left. I've already lived longer than many of the people I worked with in the mill. Some of them are long dead, others I have lost track of. I sometimes wonder what became of them, whether they escaped as I did, or whether they remained in the mills until their bodies could no longer sustain the work. Looking back on my life now, I am struck by several things. The first is a kind of sorrow for the child I was, for the years of my life that were consumed by the mill. I was 6 years old when I entered that place. I was 24 when I left it. Those were years when my mind was developing, when I might have learned more, when I might have had time to play and to rest and to simply be a child. Instead, I was made into a working part of a machine, my childhood taken from me and converted into profit for people I never knew. The second thing is a kind of anger. When I was young, I was told that the system was right and good, that the owners were benefactors, that I should be grateful. I've come to understand that this was a lie, told to make the unbearable seem acceptable. The owners were not benefactors. They were people pursuing profit, and they were willing to sacrifice the health and welfare of children to achieve that profit. The system was not good. It was extractive and cruel and inefficient in human terms, though very efficient in terms of producing wealth for a small number of people. But the third thing, and perhaps the most important, is a kind of peace. I survived. I endured the mill and I left it. I built a life after it. I became a person with agency and choices, and I have lived long enough to see some of the things I hoped for come to pass. The laws limiting child labour have become more stringent. The working hours have been reduced. The safety conditions have improved. The world has not become perfect, far from it, but it has become, in some ways, less cruel. I am setting down these memories because I want there to be a record. I want people to know what it was like to be a child in the mills of Victorian Britain. I want them to understand that the great wealth that was generated during this period, the buildings that were constructed, the industrial capacity that was created, all of this was built on the backs of children like me, children whose names are not recorded anywhere, whose individual suffering is forgotten even though the system that caused it has become legendary. I want people to understand that each machine, each spindle, each bolt of cloth that came out of those mills represented human cost. It represented the hours of children's lives, the damage to their lungs and their hands and their eyes. It represented childhoods that were stolen, education that was denied, possibilities that were foreclosed. But I also want people to understand something else. I want them to understand the resilience of the human spirit. I survived the mill. I endured it, yes, but I also learned from it. I learned to work hard. I learned to observe carefully. I learned the value of persistence. I learned that it is possible to survive conditions that seem unbearable. I learned that change is possible, that systems that seem permanent and inevitable can be challenged and altered. The children who worked in the mills were not passive victims. They were people with agency, with hopes and dreams, with a capacity for joy and kindness and connection, even in the darkest circumstances. We supported each other. We found ways to make the work bearable. We created small moments of pleasure and connection in the midst of the machinery and the noise and the dust. When I close my eyes now, I do not remember only the hardship and the exhaustion. I remember the faces of the people I worked with. I remember Sarah's swift fingers as she tied the threads. I remember Eleanor asking her dangerous questions about why things had to be as they were. I remember the brief moments of laughter that we managed to create, the small kindnesses that people showed each other, the human warmth that persisted even in a place that was fundamentally inhuman. I remember too the smell of the mill, not just the dust and the oil, but also the particular smell of the place, a kind of composite smell that I have never encountered anywhere else. I remember the sound of the machines, which I hated, and which also became almost musical to me, with its rhythms and its variations. I remember the feel of the threads between my fingers, the way the work became so automatic that my hands could perform the tasks while my mind wandered to other places. These memories are mixed together, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the terrible. I cannot separate them. They are all part of the same experience, the same period of my life. They have made me who I am. I am 73 years old now. The coal fires that heat my small house make my lungs worse, but I do not want to be cold. The evenings are long, and I spend much of them looking back, trying to make sense of the years, trying to understand what my life meant and what it contributed to. I think often about the question of whether it was worth it. Was it worth surviving the mill if the years that followed were so much less comfortable than they might have been had I lived a different life? Was it worth the damage to my body, the permanent scarring of my lungs, the persistent pain in my hands and back? I do not think I would choose the mill if given the choice again. But given that the choice was not actually mine, that I was born into poverty and desperation, that I had no real option but to work in the mill, I think I can say that I did what I could with what I had. I worked, I survived, I left when I could, I built a different life, I loved and was loved, I had children and grandchildren, I read books and learned things, I thought about the world and tried to understand it. Would you have known hunger by its sound? Have you ever counted minutes by the creak of a wheel? Have you ever felt the particular exhaustion that comes from doing the same motions for 12 hours a day? Have you ever breathed air so thick with dust that you could taste it on your tongue, feel it coating your lungs, see it reflected in the light of the lamps? I have, and I'm here to tell you that it was real, that we were real. That the children who worked in the mills of the 19th century were not statistics or historical curiosities. We were people. We had hopes and fears and dreams. We had bodies that could hurt and minds that could think. We had the capacity for wonder and joy and connection, even in the midst of conditions that were designed to break us. The mill is gone now. The building where I spent my childhood was torn down decades ago. The machines are gone. The owners are dead. The system has been reformed, though not destroyed. The industrial process continues, but with somewhat more awareness of human cost. But the memory remains. I remain. And as long as I am alive, as long as I can speak and think and remember, I will bear witness to what it was like. I will tell the story of the child I was, the work that shaped me, the years that I lost, and the strength that I found. This is my testimony. This is what I have to say. This is the truth as I have lived it.